There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from never quite fitting the story being told about your generation. You're too young to be Gen X, but every time someone describes millennials, entitled tech native, raised on participation trophies, something in you recoils. That's not you either. You exist in a gap that most people don't even know is there. And that gap, it turns out, has a name. Researchers started calling people born between 1976 and 1985 Xennials around 2014. Some sociologists call it a microgeneration, a shadow generation. But whatever label you use, the psychology of it is genuinely worth sitting with. Because the specific slice of history you grew up in didn't just shape your preferences. It likely influenced how you experience uncertainty, identity, and change. And most of it happened without you even noticing. Let's start at the beginning. Your childhood was analog in a way that's almost impossible to fully explain to someone who grew up with a smartphone in their hand. You had a specific after-school routine that didn't involve a screen. You had a best friend whose number you had memorized. You had a Saturday morning that was actually worth waking up early for. And if something went wrong socially, a fight with a friend, an embarrassing moment at school, it had a natural expiration date. You went home. The thing ended. Nobody was documenting it, tagging you in it, or posting about it hours later. Your social pain had a ceiling, which is something almost nobody names when they talk about growing up pre-internet. There was also something else nobody names: genuine, unstructured boredom. Hours with nothing scheduled and no device to fill the gap, where your mind had no choice but to wander, invent, and eventually settle. That kind of boredom isn't a deficit. Developmental psychologists have noted that unstructured time in childhood is closely linked to creativity, self-direction, and the ability to tolerate discomfort without immediately reaching for a distraction. Skills that, quietly, turned out to matter a lot. Stress researchers have long emphasized the importance of recovery time after social and emotional strain. The idea that after something stressful, the nervous system needs genuine downtime to regulate. You had that built into your childhood architecture by default. Walking home from school was decompression. Riding a bike to nowhere in particular was decompression. Your brain got to finish processing one thing before the next thing arrived. Research on stress regulation suggests that this kind of rhythmic, low-stimulation time plays a meaningful role in building emotional resilience over the long term. You didn't call it that. You just called it Tuesday. Then something shifted. Right as you were moving from adolescence into early adulthood, the exact developmental window when identity is most in flux, the entire social world went digital. Friendster arrived in 2002, then MySpace in 2003, then Facebook in 2004, which in its early years felt less like a social network and more like a live wire dropped into ordinary life. Suddenly, the social dynamics you had spent years navigating face-to-face had a new arena, new rules, and no instruction manual. And you were old enough to remember the before, but young enough that your brain was still developing enough to adapt. Neuroscience research consistently shows that the prefrontal cortex, the region most involved in identity formation, decision-making, and social processing, continues developing until the mid-20s. Xennials hit this transition right in the middle of that window. You weren't a digital native and you weren't a digital immigrant. You were something more specific and more interesting than either of those things. You were the generation that learned both languages. And here's where things get genuinely unusual. When you grow up entirely in one paradigm, your sense of normal is fixed. Gen X had analog normal. Younger millennials have digital normal. You have two reference points that sometimes pull against each other in ways you've probably never put into words. You know what it feels like to be unreachable for an entire afternoon and have that feel peaceful rather than anxious. But you also know what it's like to be constantly reachable and feel that as just the texture of modern life. You hold both of these experiences as real. Neither one feels foreign. You could think of this as a kind of cognitive flexibility, the ability to move between two very different modes of being. Though it's worth saying that this is more of an interpretive frame than a measured psychological finding. What is measurable is that adapting to a complete shift in how humans communicate during the years when your sense of self was still forming was a real and significant thing to live through. But now here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The part where things get harder. A significant portion of Xennials entered the workforce in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which meant you were just starting to find your footing, figuring out your career, maybe buying your first place, beginning to build something, when two massive disruptions hit back to back. The dot-com crash wiped out entire industries that people your age had invested in, literally and professionally. And then, just when things were stabilizing, 2008 arrived. Research on the psychological effects of economic disruption during early adulthood is fairly consistent on this. Financial instability during the years when you're first trying to establish independence doesn't just set you back practically. It tends to install a kind of background wariness that doesn't fully leave even after your financial situation improves. Economists and psychologists refer to this as economic scarring. The way sudden insecurity during a formative life stage changes how you evaluate risk, how much you trust stability, and how much you allow yourself to want things. So what you're actually working with, if you're a Xennial, is this layered combination. The emotional resilience that comes from an analog childhood. The adaptability that came from living through a total overhaul of how human beings communicate right at the moment when you were still figuring out who you were. And the underlying, often unspoken wariness that comes from having the ground shift beneath you economically, not once, but twice, right when you were trying to build something solid. Nobody put those three things together and said, this is what this generation is carrying. The cultural conversation tends to flatten it into generation war content. Gen X versus millennials, boomers versus everyone. But that framing misses something real. The paradox at the center of the Xennial experience is that you are simultaneously more adaptable and more cautious than most people around you give you credit for. You learned to adapt because you had to. You lived through a complete transformation of how human beings communicate and socialize, and you integrated it without falling apart. But you are also careful in a way that younger people sometimes misread as pessimism and older people sometimes misread as entitlement. It's neither. It's the rational response to having watched things you believed in collapse. Twice. Adaptability and wariness aren't contradictions in you. They're the same story told from two different angles. And there's one more thing worth naming. Xennials are now in their 40s, which puts many of you in a life stage that psychologists, drawing on work from Erik Erikson and others, have long associated with deeper reflection, a point where people naturally start re-examining the choices they've made and asking whether the life they've built reflects who they actually are. For most people, that kind of reflection happens against a relatively stable cultural backdrop. For Xennials, it's happening while technology is again transforming how people work, connect, and find meaning. You've been here before. The scale is different, but the shape of the experience is familiar. You've already proved you can adapt to a world that changes faster than it gives you time to prepare. That's not a small thing. And maybe that's exactly what this moment needs. Not people who've only ever known one way of doing things, but people who've already survived the transition from one world to another and came out the other side still standing. If you've never quite felt like you belonged in either the Gen X story or the Millennial story, that's not a gap in your identity. That's actually the most honest thing about you. You were formed by a specific set of conditions that don't fit neatly into the categories we use to talk about generations. And the psychology that came out of those conditions is more complex and more durable than any of those categories give you credit for. The generation that learned to hold two worlds at once is, arguably, the one best equipped to live in a world that keeps asking everyone to do exactly that. If this resonated, consider subscribing. I make videos on exactly this kind of psychology, the stuff that runs underneath ordinary life and shapes it in ways you don't always see until someone points it out. I'll see you in the next one.